A very warm welcome to you all to this panel that's called Rethinking Spatiality, Moving Beyond the Urban. My name is Sudeshna Mitra, and I am faculty at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. We have four very interesting papers today. In the schedule, you might have seen five. One set of presenters couldn't make it today, so we are going to have four papers today. These are very interesting papers that take very different kinds of entry points, and they are situated across multiple locations across the global south. But seen together, they are actually offering a whole set of provocations to rethink the dominant imaginations and the categories that we typically use to understand what is going on in terms of process and in terms of categories of the contemporary urban. So just as a sort of the kind of logistic side of the thing, we will do the papers in order. If I could ask everyone who's listening in to sort of start putting your questions down in the Q&A box that you see on your screens. And authors will respond to it, after their presentations. But typically, right at the end, we will have about 30 minutes when we can have a discussion across all of the papers. So, without too much delay, the first paper is Urban Life at the Extensions Beyond Binaries, which is being presented by AbdouMaliq Simone. He's a senior professorial fellow from the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield. And his paper is really using the word extension as a way to push us to disrupt and unsettle the dominant categories that we use to conceive not only urban form, but even urban living and inhabiting. So without delay, Malik, if you can take
over. Thanks, Sudeshna. The thing is that this was to be a kind of conceptual introduction to the papers that are not happening today. So I'm not sure how this will work. But my other to the other two colleagues that were supposed to present today, we're all part of a collective that is looking at this notion of urban life at the extensions, and sort of playing around with this notion of extensions. I think we're all in some ways familiar with one particular kind of iteration of this notion of extensions that is conveyed in some of these images of built environments at the peripheries that will be familiar to all of you. But there is in some ways a kind of imagination and representation of the extensions that goes beyond simply their pointing to particular kinds of built environments at the peripheries and hinterlands, but a process of extensions that in some ways can show up anywhere. And so these are some images that attempt to convey a kind of broader canvas of what we are trying to think through when we talk about this notion of extensions. So extended urbanization, in the sense of Lefebvre and the sense of Christian Schmidt and Roger Kyle, that we're also, I think, fairly familiar with, and Roberto Montemor, conventionally refers to multifaceted processes through which urbanization articulates different logic and territories. Yet extensions reflect a going beyond that can take place anywhere, and which is manifested not only in new territorial formations, but also in ways of living and inhabiting. So acts of extending urban form and life do not simply reproduce the dominant modes of valuation, but they unsettle, they disrupt familiar categorization as inhabitants attempt to situate themselves in the midst of increasingly unsettled terrain. So extensions and extending then are at the heart of an interplay between attempts to resettle and unsettle, to extract as much as possible, but also to operate where nothing apparent is to be gained, nothing useful to the prolongation either of the urban or of life. Extensions thus reach outwards to be a part of or a part in, like the parting of the waves, a part in the world, to institute a rupture in the terms of belonging, a belonging that is too often hedged and parsed and recombined and securitized. So this notion of extending also in some sense is a refusal to be useful. It's a stance against everywhereness found in the proliferation of dead exchanges, where discourses of freedom and development become merely aspects of a social infrastructure of continuous assessment about the efficacies of particular bodies and their trajectories and interactions. So extensions and extending seek to be more than a distribution of effective inclinations that can be steered along specific dispositions of expenditure. Extensions draw attention to intensive entanglements across different locations, to different ways of living, different games of getting by, different logics and identities of what any given place might be. Extensions are augmentations of urban information processes and decision support systems, territorial management, surveillance and control, as well as the unforeseen ways in which urban spaces can offer inexplicable affordances. So they both extend, they both extend in the notion of augmentation, of lending credence to, of developing new ways in which sort of familiar processes of decisions can be made, territories can be managed, at the same time as ushering in unanticipated ways in which the urban can offer affordances that have yet and not yet have a kind of language of account. So this is not only about seeking to overthrow the current system by suggesting new models or imposing utopian visions, but it's about extending the possibilities for putting existing materials to new uses. And so extensions are spatial, insofar as sites, contexts, and institutions overstep their boundaries and extend themselves out into the world. Dimensions are added onto houses, streets, or neighborhoods, but then these take on a life of their own, often emerging out of multiple overlapping tenure regimes or regulatory frameworks. Extensions are corporeal in the sense of how particular kinds of bodies extend themselves into the earth to preclude exhaustive extractions, and how bodies may be renewed beyond discernible modalities of social reproduction, beyond the household, beyond the social network, beyond the community, beyond all the familiar kinds of contexts that we associate with social reproduction. And extensions are also a temporal matter, where time itself is extended or suspended during crisis or transition, through slow and fast forms of policy and governance, through waiting it out and anticipating better futures, when the city is haunted by all of that. Extensions are existential, both the terms of recomposing the intersections of life and death, the way each is concretized, and the way the powers of life and death are extended into each other through technicities and even more brazen, expanded displays. In this constant shift of extensions, operations are always in motion, animated by aspirations, desires that are also always in flux. Multiple ambitions, competencies, and capacities converge in the unceasing reclaiming of land, resources, time, and imagination. In some kind of concrete, more focused, concrete, empirical ways, and if you well know the work of someone like Sali Benjamin, one can see that sometimes extensions entail edges and interstices, whose intensities of occupation waver depending upon time of day, and a series of rhythmic surges and ebbs, also constitute the basis for other extensions. Here, the distinctions of building and spatial products can blur into each other, as the layering of different and sometimes countervailing tenure statuses, situated histories of inhabitation and use, extend, for example, the apartment block into a series of kiosks, resting spaces for motorbike taxi drivers, backyard shacks that host music clubs and card games, and small shrines to disparate spirits, or a makeshift shelter for those awaiting transport, or a small vegetable and flower garden, or an impromptu car washing business. All of these spaces have been generated by different actors under different pretexts, negotiations, and claims of proprietorship and responsibilities for maintenance. They not only blur a sense of an original structure, but also blur the proportionality of authority at work. And this is something we really want to emphasize about this notion of extensions, is this sense of blurring proportionality. We're so accustomed in terms of engaging particular kinds of spaces and urbanization processes, in terms of certain kinds of genealogies of account or accounting or computing. How much of this is maximizing ground rent? How much of this is reflective of particular kinds of neoliberal governance policies? How much of this is formal or informal? How much? What is the tenure status on pieces of land? And we're not trying to suggest that these genealogies are not important, but there are ways in which the efforts and initiatives to compose, to elaborate, to extend one's spaces of living, residing, and operating gather together and intersect in ways that compose particular dispositions where it is very difficult to tell for sure just what the kinds of quantitative components are, the how much is this, how much is that. Rather, there are ways in which spaces are elaborated where it's difficult to tell these kinds of proportions. There's a blurring of value. There's a blurring of the need to make an account, the blurring to decide what counts for what and whose life counts and what kinds of ways. And other times, extensions operate as a means of tying together discrepant contexts in varying degrees of mutual implication. So those who sell household goods in a market may join a common church that is also attended by union members who work in cleaning municipal offices, who in turn order supplies from this market, which is also involved in a cooperative housing savings group sponsored by still another church somewhere else. So in such instances, the kinds of discernible identities of particular kinds of context in their extensions extend themselves into each other in a way which blur precise definitions and designations of exactly what is taking place. And within that blur is not a kind of necessarily ambiguity or confusion, but a space of operation where things can shift quite quickly, shift between certain ways and logics of operating into others and shift still again. So it is these shifts in the sort of mode of how things can be done, which in some ways is at the heart of this notion of extensions. And so in some ways, we think through a lot of the concept of this notion of extensions in the kind of extended forms of urbanization that we're familiar with. The way in which space is in some sense elongated, in which things spread out and come together through a heterogeneity of different processes, where the overarching logic of how things are to operate next to each other, that next to these contiguities, what will they be to each other, is yet to be settled for sure. But there is something fundamental within that kind of unsettling process, which itself in some ways is generative of a kind of urban space, which I think is important to pay attention to. So thank you very much. That's it for now.
Thank you so much, Malik. That was such an interesting, so many strands of thought to think about, so many provocations there. Next, we are going to move to Jhono. Jhono Bennett. He's from Bartlett School of Architecture at the University College of London. His paper is called Spatial Design Practice in a Post-Post City, a situated Southern urbanist inquiry. His work is coming from a post-colonial, post-apartheid situatedness in South Africa. And he's going to be telling us about basically the positional dimensions of practice, especially spatial design, and the city systems that they are working in, and the ways in which these practices are really entangled with socio-systemic nature of spatial inequality in South Africa. So without more delay, over to you, Jhono.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sudeshna, and thank you, the previous speaker. It's as I was saying, it's always a bit strange to be speaking at a panel where you are referencing one of your co-panelists. So let me try and share the screen. Great. So today I'll just be sharing a short introduction to the kind of early methodological findings of my current doctoral study. I'm not even sure if I can call them findings. It's just sort of where I'm at. And it's just really important to forefront that this work is within my practice-orientated PhD by design at UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture. And this work draws a lot from the last 10 years of my work and practice here in Johannesburg in South Africa. Apologize, that shouldn't be there. So South African cities remain among the most unequal urban areas in the world. The tacit logics of their design-built form play a significant role in how these inequalities continue to manifest decades after social and political reform. But while the social spatial forces that lead to these asymmetries were not an impassive byproduct of centuries of segregated development, they were conceptualized, drawn, designed, and implemented by built environment practitioners, individual spatial designers who were socially, historically, technically, and ethically situated in South Africa. This observation is made to highlight and draw focus to an important and underexplored interstellar dimension of agency that I've seen exist between the individual practitioners, the disciplines, and the socio-spatial systems that I feel require more situated forms of exploration around spatial practice, and in particular in regards to the city-making forces of contemporary South Africa, as well as similarly spatially unjust contexts. In response to this observation, I began my own process of developing a positionally critical and situated research framework that I'm aligning to the growing efforts of Southern theoretical scholars whose work emphasizes the development of more locational and theoretically contextualized approaches to research. An architectural or even a design-focused reading of Southern urbanism remains fairly uncharted territory in this field, with a working paper presentation from British Nigerian architect Dr. Ola Oduku, one of the few published references available to draw from. This focused gap presents a highly relevant position from which to launch the study and gives direction for a broader inquiry to expand on Southern urbanism's principles of an approach that works from place, recognizes concepts of periphery, and conducts what Brazilian urbanist Teresa Caldeira refers to as research with an accent. In line with this, I'm interested in finding ways or methodologies that revalue the type of creative socio-technical design work that not only produces tangible outputs such as buildings, but rather focuses on people, processes, and our collective imaginaries of self and space that engage with larger systems of inequality at play in our built environment, such dynamics that Edward Said refers to as imaginative geographies. I am generally interested in the nature of how. In particular, I am interested in how the how manifests in spatial design practice, particularly at the individual scale, and how these collective hows affect the city or the system, an inquiry that I feel is understandably underexamined, notoriously difficult, and lies somewhere beyond the current binaries of our current what and hows. I also feel there is no better place than oneself to start such a situated inquiry on how, towards which I've been conducting several exercises that precede this and blend into this doctoral project that I'll share today. In an argument for a Southern perspective, the late planner Vanessa Watson describes how the work of Jean and John Kamarov's questions the positioning of Western Enlightenment as the normative theoretical base from which urban scholarship is drawn. By doing so, she is referring to what sociologist Rachel Connell describes as the Southern turn, a scholarly shift that has been taking place in contemporary academia and in regards to urban studies that makes the case for the development of alternative theoretical resources against current dominant urban discourse. A sentiment shared by many Southern city scholars, such as Jennifer Robinson, who in the face of neoliberal and post-colonial discourse on cities, explains that urban theoretical insights cannot be based on the experiences of a small selection of globally wealthy cities. Southern theory has been developed over the last decades between these writings and around these concepts of the South, to which the upperalization and the concepts underpinning its use are as important as the subject matter it is associated with. To this point, I would like to articulate the rationale for framing my larger study through Southern principles rather than decolonization. This has been done as an ethical means of acknowledging what Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang describe as the incommensurable limits of someone in my position to conduct decolonial scholarly work in the current academic context, as well as Tariq Jazeel and Colin McFarlane's description on the limits of such work, while carefully acknowledging and internalizing Gautam and others' contribution to the decolonial discourse on the clear distinction between decoloniality and decolonization. The important link the scholars on decoloniality appear to share with Southern theory is a critical acknowledgement of displaced communities of knowledge and efforts of rearticulating these knowledges through critical actions. Gautam describes his work around vocabularies for Southern urbanism as a mode of theory building that is simultaneously tied to his research and is particularly focused on aspects of practice in Southern cities. He describes the South as a relational project and not a grouping of places, but as a set of moving peripheries. The emergent nature of Southern urbanist discourse should not be understated, and although it proactively self-defines universal definition, several scholars offer useful framing, such as Ashia Mbembe and Sarah Nuttall's recognizable frame through which cities of the global South are perceived and understood, their differences mapped and located, or by interpretations of Edgar Peterson, AbdouMaliq Simone's categorization of Southern cities as cities where the majority holds political, economic, spatial, and ecological vulnerability. This vulnerability is not necessarily intended to be framed through a developmental or pessimistic lens, but can elicit other forms of city making that often defy contemporary urban analytical means or binary readings of the North and South. Although Southern urbanist framings can be critiqued as temporal, or as Mfanaseni Fanasi Slanganyana warns us, carries a concern for demographic cooptation. As an emerging field, it offers a supportive and generative and defensible framework, or as Simone describes it, an epistemic force field for this study's starting point, and holds the potential to align with Ashia Mbembe's search for alternative acts of thinking and exploring. Drawing from concerns of location and action in Southern theory, positionality as understood as a stance of the researcher in regards to the social and political context of the study is carefully acknowledged and grounds much of the study's framework. While positionality is considered to be a multidimensional and evolving concept, the concerns discussed here are considered to be led by feminist scholars such as Linda McDowell, who tell us that we must recognize and take account of our own position as well as that of our research participants and route this into our research practice. Donna Haraway offers one of the earliest framings on these concerns of power, partial perspective, and positioning in her essays on situated knowledges. Haraway suggests that such feminist objectivity from multiple partial perspectives offers a greater form of objectivity that presents positioning as a key practice in grounding and locating this knowledge. Towards such partial situated questions on locationality, accountability, and positional moods, the work that I conducted over this last year surfaced to the fore in the site writing module that I took part under my co-supervisor, Professor Jane Rendell. Site writing as a methodology is grounded in working from and through site with an importance on the concepts of ethics, both locationally as well as situationally, through creative methods of writing and making through site. For this, I chose a site in a moment right before I started my own social design-based practice, one-to-one agency of engagement, when I was working for the Shack Dwellers International NGO in 2012. Here I was placed as socio-technical support to the Marlborough Warehouse Crisis Committee, an industrial buffer strip that separates Alexandra Township from Sandton, in one of Johannesburg's wealthiest suburbs in South Africa. During this period, the city of Johannesburg evicted over 500 families and was eventually taken to court by the residents, where the High Court later deemed the eviction to be illegal. During the rehousing process, the city's lawyers were technically specific on what they would allow the residents to rebuild in order to avoid further evictions. They offered technical limitations to specifications such as 1 meter high structures, a ban on zinc as a material, and a bizarre restriction of poles over 1.2 meters long. As socio-technical support and with the leadership of the Marlborough Warehouse Crisis Committee, we questioned the lawyers if we could use these biased and uninformed technical descriptions against the city. For example, could we use polycarbonate instead of zinc? Could we use a longer truss instead of a pole? The lawyers cautioned us not to push back the boundaries of what the police read as an informal dwelling, i.e. a shack, and suggested we adhere to what they termed the spirit of the order. In the end, we decided on tents, as this felt as a temporary enough while providing fairly, if not barely adequate shelter, and did not counter the spatial imaginaries of a police officer's understanding of an informal dwelling. These contested imaginaries are on what the lawyers, the police, and the city of Johannesburg felt defined a shack. It's what they defined as an adequate home, or even an appropriate set of actions around the individual scale of the larger issues of spatial inequality have sat deeply with me these last 10 years. They guided me in this exercise towards re-examining these actions, the materials, and led the process of writing many autoethnographies, looking over the court documents, and engaging with various of the terms and actors employed in the process. What ultimately emerged in this was a form of animative analysis, an animation method that allowed for reflection through the medium of animation production, as well as documenting the very human, individual, and the moments between the people and the material that made up these individual spatial practices. Animation has become the study's primary method for documentation, analysis, and ultimately speculation as the primary design research method. Working closely with these images and through iterative and repetitive actions of both drawing and writing through a blend of digital and physical formats, our study has examined these non-verbal, communicative, and embodied aspects of a designly approach to creative research that resonate with African Futures Institute's Dr. Leslie Loco's recognition for the need to create the conditions in which voices which haven't been given the opportunity to express themselves are able to do so freely, creatively, and intuitively. That's the video part. In recognition to both the southern importance of working from place, the iterative, visual, and reflective aspects of Professor Rendell's sight writing practice, in particular her critical spatial practice, I've discovered an epistemically critical and situated methodological framework to conduct the study. While the study sits theoretically between the disciplines of architecture, urban studies, the disciplinary techniques of art practice have offered necessary freedoms and means to critically interrogate and positionally write through these conditions of South Africa's post-apartheid and post-colonial spatial practices through what I've come to term as the post-post city. While this method is still in its early stages of development and requires more forms of iteration and creative interrogation, and most importantly, a careful regrounding in context, I place this intent with Edgar Peterson and AbdouMaliq Simone's call for an opening up of a fertile research agenda for more grounded and spatially attuned phonetic research. And I'm allowing these more situated, creative, and positionally aware forms of spatial research to guide my study moving forward. This will be further enhanced in the coming 2 years as I aim to include an extensive period of co-making here in South Africa and engage in more conversations with spatial design practitioners both here as well as in the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jhono. That was a really interesting presentation and very nice to kind of like just hear about sight writing and also, your images that gave us a really good sense of, what you were talking about and sort of how it's getting translated to practice. Just a quick reminder to those who are listening in that please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. We will get to them at the end of all of the presentations, but please feel free to kind of start putting in your questions there now. Now we're going to move to the next paper. This is a paper that is jointly being presented by Stuti Haldar from IIHS and Gautam Sharma, who is from DST, Center for Policy Research from the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. Their paper is called Spaces for Citizen-Driven Innovation, Mapping Tensions and Potentials Within Urban Makerspaces. And it's a very interesting paper where they introduce us to the idea of makerspaces, hackerspaces, and fab labs, and take kind of a global South city perspective situated in Bangalore to contrast it with the usual imaginations of these spaces being high-tech and innovative, and looking at what these spaces look like when we're talking about global South cities, and positioning them as sort of commons-based peer production as they are, and differentiating them from sort of industrial scale, centralized production kind of spaces. So Stuti and Gautam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sudeshna. So basically, so first I'll be just sharing the screen. Let me know if it's visible.
Yeah, it's visible, Stuti. If you can go to the presentation mode, that would be
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this study is basically, it's a working paper right now, and we'll be presenting our preliminary findings from the study today. So basically, this study is important because, as we know, that with the contemporary phenomena of hyper-urbanization, cities are emerging as economic focal points, and these are also understood as sites of socio-political and cultural contestations. And in the contemporary times, the role of technology is being crystallized when it comes to conceptualizing modern, or as we know them, smart cities. And this sort of notion of urban utopia actually pervades through top-down, centrally controlled technological solutions to issues of urbanization, such as water management, waste management, energy efficiency, and even citizen mobility. However, these top-down technocratic interventions have gained criticism in the recent decades due to their lack of attention to socio-cultural and behavioral contextualities, the aspirations and alternate knowledge systems of city dwellers, specifically when it comes to the global South. And as we know that the cities in global South are inherently messy, heterogeneous, and informal, and this makes them emerge as a complex reality that challenges the standardization and one-size-fits-all approach. So in this context, the current study draws attention to the commons-based peer production as an alternative to industrial scale centralized models of production. And makerspaces, or making as a culture, operates within this paradigm of open source co-production. Although predominantly an urban phenomena, these makerspaces are heralded as means to democratize knowledge and innovations through informal collaborative networks. And this phenomena the concept of makerspace, although emerged in the West and particularly in the US, interestingly, we observe that there exist differences in the contextualization of these makerspaces when it comes to the West and the global South. The Western makerspaces are characterized with the use of more sophisticated technology like 3D printers, CNC lathe, laser cutters, etc. While making in the global South, specifically in India, is a long-standing culture which is associated with low-tech innovations carried out by artisans, woodworkers, farmers, and even electricians. And in the Indian context, therefore, making is often referred as what we know as jugaad innovations, grassroots innovations, or bricolage. So in this backdrop, the current study, the objective of the current study is to understand how the phenomena of makerspaces in India can be conceptualized in the sense of the pluralities that are associated with its functioning and organizational structure, and how, and we also posit that these makerspaces in India serve as possibility spaces for collaborative action, cross-curricular connections, innovation, learning, and creativity using a bottom-down approach rather than a top-down. Bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. Now, coming to the methodology, Bangalore is recognized as the technology capital of India, and it hosts one of the best innovation ecosystems in India, with numerous MNCs, premier science, technology, innovation institutions, and R&D labs. And therefore, this has been selected as the site for this study. The sample comprises of actors involved in the maker spaces. They are founders, makers, hobbies, students, artisans, etc. The sampling technique was purposive, and it's a qualitative research design that we have adopted. So primary data was collected using semi-structured interviews, and we also did some secondary data analysis using secondary data sources like gray literature, the websites of makerspaces, social media accounts, etc. And the data analysis technique used is mainly thematic analysis of content and content analysis. So for this working paper right now, the sample size comprises of 6 founders or managers of makerspaces in Bangalore, 3 makers, and 3 academia stakeholders who are experts in the field of making culture in with respect to India. So the paper is divided into 2 sections. In the first section, we profile the maker spaces based on the mode of operation, location of actors, intentionality, and types of makers. And we also demonstrate that how in each dimension, there are pluralities associated with these maker spaces because they are highly informal and a very complex structure. Also, in the second part, we discuss the functions or the potentials of these maker spaces. For instance, they are contributors to circular economy, they promote radical innovations, etc. Now, for the first section, that is profiling of the makerspaces, when we talk about the mode of operation, makerspaces in Bangalore are majorly informal possibility spaces which are nested within formal institutions or often financed by formal enterprises. For instance, if we talk about the IKP Eden, it's a formal hardware product startup incubator, and it houses its own DIY makerspace that allows hobbyists, professionals, and industry actors to innovate or just tinker around with technology outside of their institutional rules and settings, hence making the mode of operation informal. So similarly, if we look into the narrative by the founder of the workshop, which is Think Happy Everyday Workshop, then he said that we run allied companies, so we can run architecture and advertising. So these are formal businesses. So they're actually funding the workshop, and we have been able to keep it open without necessarily looking at any investor who might then change how we function. Coming to the location of these actors, these maker spaces are possibility spaces where actors from diverse geographical settings come together to co-create, imagine solutions to everyday problems, or just play around with technology. So makers belong to, the urban maker spaces belong to the urban, rural, as well as peri-urban settings. For instance, in terms of the operation manager of workbench projects, we had a maker who came all the way from US during the peak of the second wave, and he wanted to make a frugal oxygen concentrator, which can be developed from local available materials and can be assembled easily by anyone all over the country. The next dimension where we try to understand the pluralities inherent in the maker spaces in Bangalore comprises of the intentionality or motives that why these maker spaces are being operated. So basically, the maker spaces portray or demonstrate a mix of all these sorts of motivations or intentionality. Like some maker spaces are more profit driven and run on an incubation model, while others are more driven towards the ethos of open sharing and social innovations. But it's not that one maker space would just discreetly show only one form of intentionality or motive to sort of operationalize. So to operate. So for example, when we talk about the founder of Maker Farm, it's predominantly a for-profit incubation model that this makerspace runs on. They say that we are a bootstrapped startup. We help others to come up with ideas, and we charge them as per their pockets. If they are able to pay, we charge them. To some people, we do not charge anything. So we can clearly see that there's a mix of open sharing as well as profit-driven innovations. Whereas on the other hand, if we see the narrative by the founder of Jaga, so it is predominantly a makerspace that functions on the ethos of open sharing and social innovations. And so the founder said that we never charged anyone in the beginning, and we were all only interested in having a co-working space where people can come come up to discuss idea. And initially it was, Jaga was started as a short duration project, but once it gained popularity, we carried on the idea forward. Okay. So the next dimension on which we would try to analyze the pluralities in the organizational structure of makerspaces is the types of makers or collaborators. So it is a heterogeneous mix. An ideal makerspace is a heterogeneous mix of software developers, artisans, researchers, farmers, students, and therefore makers can be from varied educational as well as occupational backgrounds and age groups. For example, the founder of the workshop said that we had everyone visit us, from an 8-year-old girl to an engineer from Netherlands. Our first actual member is now running a company in the US, and we have applications for internships from all over India from students. Our woodworking workshops are also attended by people from different parts of the state. Now, the second part of this paper discusses about the potentials or the functions of these maker spaces, and the data that we have collected so far shows that that instead of performing a single function, each maker space uses technology in multiple ways to solve varied problems of urbanization, society, and environment. So the first function that we identified from the themes, recurring themes from the narratives as well as the secondary literature, was that of circular economy or repair maker spaces. So maker spaces in Bangalore basically function as spaces for sustainability-driven co-creation, as their practices demonstrate synergies to the circular economy and repair economy paradigm. For example, the Jaga maker space is built out of scrap and waste collected from city landfills and industrial waste streams. In this aspect, we can look into the narrative of the operation manager of Workbench project. And he said that we make sure not to discard any materials until every person has taken a look at it. We have a section where people store their discarded materials and can be used in some of the other projects. Many makers also indulge in frugal making using the raw materials available cheaply and abundantly in the region. One of the makers prototyping a low-cost oxygen concentrator is using the unused discarded 20-liter water bottle. The next function that we identified was that of resilient innovations or manufacturing. The ongoing pandemic has demonstrated us all that grassroots communities like the maker spaces have higher degree of resilience against disruption of global value chains, because they sort of function on local procuring of manufacturing products and extracting informal networks, benefits from informal networks. So since the COVID-19 crisis, maker spaces in Bangalore adopted resilient manufacturing by coming up with social innovations to provide critical healthcare equipment such as face shields and ventilators, etc. And these maker spaces were not established during this pandemic. Rather, they had been there since decades and had been placemaking in the urban settings. The pandemic only made these maker spaces more visible as an alternative production model. So basically, when we look at the narrative in this respect, we can see that Maker Asylum in Mumbai and the Fractal Works in Bangalore were the first to start making the shields, and now a total of 15 maker clubs across India have joined hands to scale up the production. The another function recognized is that of radical innovations or high-tech innovations. So on one hand, maker spaces tread repair and circular economy trajectories, while on the other, they offer diverse experimental approaches that heavily rely on cutting-edge technology like the 3D printers, CNC cutters, etc. And by assessing the local supply chains and using digital technology for peer production and rapid prototyping, maker spaces function as possibility spaces for radical sustainable innovations, which is evident by the narrative of the founder of the workshop, and that an NGO commissioned us to build a giant pair of lungs that reacted in real time to the environment, and it was all over the news in Delhi and Mumbai. And this lung installation changed its color and turned black as the air quality of the city worsened. There are two more functions that we identified. One is that of common-based peer production. So Bangalore makerspaces are breeding grounds for grassroots innovations, wherein small-scale farmers, artisans, electricians, woodworkers, etc., instead of relying on commercial tools, co-develop their machinery. And this is a perfect example of makerspace promoting the culture of technological sovereignty. For example, a cotton picking machine was created by a farmer at makerspace. When we talk about interdisciplinarity in production, and this leads to achievement of citizen engagement or active citizenship to the urban infrastructures, makerspaces also has a role to play. With access to sophisticated technology, makerspaces serve as soft spaces for nurturing interdisciplinarities and bridging the gap between science and art with the use of technology. So makerspaces in Bangalore often use innovations that emerge from such interactions to promote active citizenship and to re-engage the people with their urban infrastructures. For example, the Malleshwaram Calling project by Jaga collected oral histories from residents of two neighborhoods from 1940s to 50s. And these oral histories were then fed in a dial-up software installed in a bright red black rotatory dial phone booth. And people could connect with their urban history by dialing various numbers. They could also leave back their stories. So according to the founder of Jaga, she said that projects from like these were more like interventions. I realized people were no longer taking care of the city spaces because they didn't have stories that connected them to their urban infrastructure. And this is something when you have hyper urbanization. So that's all for the study, and these are the key takeaways that we have as of now. Maker movement is relatively a new phenomenon in India, and these spaces have mostly been started by expats who return to India. Unlike the Western makerspace, the Indian makerspaces cannot be compartmentalized into fixed categories. One can see the pluralities operating within these spaces, whether it is in terms of urban or local or rural divide, industry operated or independent maker spaces, high tech, low tech, profit motives or social intentions. Community building, although through technology, is a major function of all the maker spaces. These spaces have the potential to democratize fabrication, design, prototyping, and innovation. And the notion that science and technology institutions with a fixed R&D budget can be innovators is being challenged by such maker spaces as they represent a grassroots niche. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuti and Gautam. That was fascinating to hear about these new spaces that are coming up, and especially the ways in which they are sort of making and remaking their relationships to the city. Very emerging sort of new phenomena. So thank you for that. Finally, we are moving to the last paper of the panel. This paper is by Luke. He is from the Center for Development Studies from Trivandrum. This paper is called Globalisation and the Changing Spatial Imaginaries Reflections from Contemporary Kerala. And he is using a political ecology framework as a way to sort of provoke us to think about urbanization as a process rather than the settlement topologies that are associated with binaries such as rural and urban. So over to you, Major.
Thank you. I'll start sharing my screen. Yeah, I'm Mijo. I'm PhD scholar from Center for Development Studies. So the paper is primarily concerned about the globalization and changing spatial imaginaries in a settlement in Kerala, although is known as rural. So it basically talks about how the inequality is reproduced in the contemporary times, and I want to situate in the critique of the dominant understanding of urbanization process from the global south. So as we all know, the literature on urbanization process from the global south concentrate on urban, and more studies are on metropolitan areas or large towns. So Kerala as a region historically exhibited a unique spatial pattern, which is known as rural-urban continuum, and recently is known for a distinct pattern of urban transition itself. And so in this backdrop, the paper asks questions like, how do we understand the contemporary spatial forms in the region? What are the drivers in this urbanization process? And what is the understanding of spatial imaginaries beyond the binaries of rural and urban? So as we know, the political ecology is political economy combined with the ecological concerns. And the literature on concerning urban political ecology in the urbanization process tries to put the concept called the urban as socio-metabolic transformation. And recently, the power involved in social relation is intrinsic to understand the environmental transition. So given the context, the paper basically tries to place the socio-ecological conditions. I mean, present-day socio-ecological conditions of the settlement, like changing land use and increasing transnational connections of the dominant community, and growth of service sector, and growing informality of labor from marginalized communities in the discourse of critical urban studies. So the paper is basically drawn from a fieldwork carried out in a settlement called Mutholi in the Kottayam district of Kerala, using mixed method approach. And the settlement was known for its wetland agriculture and agricultural trade to the river. Over the period, Mutholi has become an educational hub and attracts students in entrance coaching from all over Kerala. As per the census, there are 930 households from the Sudeshna community and around 350 households from the Yerwa community and 120 households from Delhi communities. So the paper employs a relational approach between the dominant community and marginalized communities. So basically shaping the political ecology. So we can see the power involved in the social relations resulted in the dominance of certain Christians in terms of control of resources and marginalization of other communities like land ownership. So the Delhi community as a whole were landless and were hutman dwellers and staying on the banks of Todu. Todu is like small water stream that flows through the earlier paddy fields. So the spatial formation of urban activities of Mutholi begins with the history of growth of business and commerce in terms of agriculture, trade and all, which involved mostly the dominant Syrian Christian community. And gradually they had a lot of profit from the agriculture, trade and all. So the Syrian Christians entered into formal employment from the 1950s onwards, and the community started colleges and other institutions in the nearby area. So even the land reform, during the land reform period and all, the land ownership did not change, and the power structure continued to practice in the spatial practices as well. Like it's a land cover map of 1990 from the of the village, and as we can see, the land was mostly concentrated on mixed crop plantation and other mixed crops and paddy areas. But recently there is a shifting economic base. Like the entrance coaching center and allied activities started in 2000 has opened a service economy in the local, and it attracts a floating population around 12,000 students every year. So 90% of the present generation of Syrian Christian community are finding professional employment, mostly in the IT sector and abroad. On the other hand, the labor from the Delhi community gradually shifted to informal labor as agriculture practices deteriorated in the village. The land use is changing to non-agrarian and livelihood portfolio is changing across the communities. So basically, there are at least 3 ways of diversification taking place, like transnational migration and the related remittances of dominant communities and business activities by them, and wage labor of the earlier agricultural labor force. So this is the land cover map of the present-day Mutoli. Like as we can see, the drastic change happened in the built-up area. Like we can say, like there are some mixed crop plantations, mostly like in the cash crops areas. Otherwise, is concentrated on built-up areas like the entrance coaching and institutions and other allied activities. We can say the busy Mutoli junction now, and the concentration of the trade activities and is building, and new concentrations are coming up there. So in all this process, I just gave a brushed up view of all this process. In all this process, inequalities are reproduced in multiple ways. So as I mentioned earlier, the land remains to be owned by the reinvesting families while land use is changing. So the agrarian base of the ecology in Mutoli presently consists of cash crops like rubber, nutmeg, arecanut, and coconut. As I mentioned, like we seen in the land cover map, the area under mixed crop plantation is mostly rubber, nutmeg, arecanut, etc. And the expansion of the built-up area is concentrated in Mutoli Junction. So all these activities does not make any changes in the lives of the marginalized communities. So the Dalit community in Mutoli engage in informal jobs, which is opened by the service sector, like domestic workers and drivers and securities, which are in the allied activities of the entrance coaching center. So the two forms of like activity, one is by the dominant community and one is by the marginal community. So this spatial formation becomes unique as a result of the transactional connections of the dominant communities and the growth of the service sector and land use changes. The spatial imaginations across community shapes in distinct ways. For example, Mutoli has offered a neoliberalist consumer space for the transnational migrants in terms of business opportunities and more investment in terms of the buildings and starting of hostels, etc. While locally, it opened up a service economy for the erstwhile agricultural labor force. So the caste-based inequality persists in the urbanization process, like as the Syrian finds new ways of accumulation to keep their dominance in the capitalist transformation. So the empirical study suggests that these locations become the size of construction activity and service sector, and making it difficult to conceptualize the overlapping spaces, like neither is rural nor urban, and is difficult to conceptualize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mijo. If you could stop sharing the screen, we could have the panel members again. And if I could request the panel members to please put your cameras on. So we have a few questions that are beginning to come into the Q&A box. If you're able to sort of read them, there are some. So I think there's one for you, Malik, if you wanted to start us off and respond to that. I also have a question for all of you, but maybe we can start with the Q&A questions to begin with. Malik, over to you. Should I read out the questions?
No, I can see it.
Okay.
So this is about what parallel can we draw between extensions and gated communities or gated enclaves.
And there's a second one by Preeti Sampath now, which talking about extensions seems rhizomatic, but extensions are also coercive and can produce conflict between modalities and actors that are deeply unequal and produce impasse. For instance, where land use change threatens dispossession. How do we think through this difference?
Yeah, I mean, there's the notion of dispossession is an important one because it cuts in all different kinds of ways. To be dispossessed, of course, is a kind of traumatic experience for those who have staked their lives on being rooted within particular kinds of places, within particular kinds of relationships, to land, to family, to extended socialities. And of course, who can be dispossessed and who dispossesses is a fundamentally unequal relationship. But the question of dispossession also is a kind of necessary one in some ways, because when we think of what it means to possess, what does it mean to possess? What does it mean to hold on to something? What does it mean to, in some ways, claim to exert a particular kind of influence or right over something? Which is also problematic within any kind of version, any kind of modality. So for me, there's a certain kind of fundamental ambivalence in terms of dispossession. Dispossession oftentimes is generative. To be dispossessed of a particular orientation, to be dispossessed of a particular responsibility or obligation to hold on and to hold, is also in some sense necessary as part of a kind of transformation process. But the question is, for whom and who does it and under what circumstances? These are the things that need to be paid attention to, because in some ways, for those that are dispossessed, what would it mean to repossess? You know, what would it mean to restabilize? Under what does dispossession allow in terms of a way of acting in the world, which in some ways the only repair on offer is a form of repossession, which in some ways cancels out that which has been learned and that which has been gained through that kind of unsettling process. So it's in some ways something just to say we need to it always needs to be looked at more closely and within the context, and not simply a sort of general statements about, you know, dispossession means this and has this particular kind of value. In terms of gated communities, I mean, one could see the gated as a kind of antithesis of the extensions, but in some ways also is a kind of moment to occasion particular kinds of extensions. I mean, the neighborhood that I spent a lot of time as an adolescent on the south side of Chicago, Englewood, is a gated community. It's a prison. It's basically a prison without walls. But you know, for the most part, mostly kids that are there have never been, you know, beyond that neighborhood, have never been to downtown Chicago at all, even though they can climb to their rooftop and see it from the rooftop. It is in some sense a gated community. What for them is a kind of mode of extension making? Well, for them, it's sound. For them, it's hip hop. For them, it's creating a kind of oral atmosphere that allows them to reach a kind of larger world of operations. So there are also different kinds of gates. There are different kinds of gated communities. There are gates that are very visible, and then there are gates that are not so visible. And the warning here is that there was a film some years ago about a gated community in Mexico, where everyone was living inside in a kind of dream, suburban, quiet life. Little did they know that just outside the walls was a completely kind of different reality that in some ways was not only encircling them, but coming up through the articulations, the water pipes, the drainage pipes appearing, inexplicably in backyards and so in some ways the fantasy of the gate is simply a fantasy, and in some ways it can only survive as a kind of gated community by occluding its own multiple articulations and its own extensions outward.
Thank you so much for that, Malik. I do have a question for you as well, but maybe we can do one round of questions for the others and then come back to you again, if that makes sense. So, Jhono, I have a question for you. Basically, I was wondering if you could, you started with the provocation that there are, certain kinds of there's a socio-systemic nature to the spatial inequality. And some of that is, as a result of entanglements with the way practice is happening. So I'm wondering that now that you sort of showed us the arc of your work and taking it all the way to site writing, if you could reflect back that now with these kinds of research methods, how do you, sort of reflect back on the idea of how practice is entangled in, if not constructing, but at least entangled in, sort of constitutive ways with this kind of socio-systemic inequality that is there in South African cities?
Cool, thanks, Sudeshna. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's only 10 minutes. And in my own work, like a large part of it, as you saw in the presentation, has been reflecting on my positionality based on how I read myself, my demographic, and how people have read me in the last, or at least 10 years of my work. And then trying to like build a method by kind of, a partial perspective of my reading of these things, but then trying to be very careful with making comments outside of myself. And that opening statement about the sort of interscalar nature of this work, I think I keep going backwards and forwards in terms of how I can articulate that. And I had this sort of constant dilemma. It actually was the name of the site writing project, was like my dilemma, but this thing of trying to not center the inquiry around myself, but also not to like the people that I've worked with in the last 10 years in the sort of fetishized, romanticized way of these, like it often happens with the urban poor getting heralded as these, like heroic figures, and to try to be very messy and honest and real and make myself complicit in those stories and entangle my own shortcomings and insecurities. And I try to be very transparent, but then also you then end up centering yourself. So I still haven't figured out how to escape this vortex of centering and recentering. But what I was kind of hoping, and that I've seen now that I'm starting to mix reflecting on practice, learning how to read the contemporary literature and kind of theorize, and then being an institution as far away from South Africa as UCL, is that somewhere in that kind of like moving backwards and forwards between that kind of personal scale and the city scale, that these sort of traces get left behind in the form of these drawings or kind of other observations that are creative that I've made, that I'm starting to see have some value and for others to like reflect on. And in the example that I showed, for example, the work in the Marlborough South, again, I was very careful to not, I did it the first time. It's like I kind of othered the people involved, for example, the police officer. But there's such a complication in terms of like making comments on sort of people's demographics in South Africa, particularly from being so far away, that the only way to do it was to draw the actions as they happened, like those sort of animated things. So I'm still not really sure how my research is going to give indications of what these practices are, or how other people read things. And our current project that I'm working on now is it's called kind of how, and I'm doing these sort of co-interviews with a group of my peers who are then spatial practitioners who do similar work. And then I'm hoping that in that sort of moving away from myself into this more collective us of like socio-technical designers, and then doing similar techniques of interviewing and making and drawing and drawing on the reflections, that there might be more traces left behind after this next round that might reveal that. So sorry, I don't have an answer. I just have a methodological answer, which has been the sort of name of the game for the last 2 years.
No, but that, I mean, that actually sort of points to what you're sort of saying as well, right? Like that this is a long durée kind of a process, and there is, it has to be a process rather than sort of kind of a solution that can come overnight. So thank you for that. Stuti and Gautam, I was wondering, so like it was really interesting to sort of see how these makerspaces are sort of, making new relationships with cities, with the urban, and in ways that may not actually exist when we talk about the urban economy otherwise. So I was wondering if you can elaborate on that a little bit more, and if you can, sort of link a little bit more concretely to, how are these spaces linked to the ideas, what does scale have to do with it, right? Is it very neighborhood level? Is it a regional kind of a modality they're taking? How are they linked to finance, and especially, formal as well as informal forms of finance? And finally, governance, because as we know that urban economy is kind of invisible in the way that the Indian governance system is set up. So how are these makerspaces, interacting with them? And, so, and how it might provoke us to think differently about the urban economy.
Yeah. So coming with the your first question on how they are being interacting with the cities and how they are coming up. So when we first started interacting, we first went to one of the maker spaces. We came to know that all these people have been trained, or they have been part of some kind of a maker space in the US or in some of the European countries, where these kind of spaces are very common. And why these spaces are common there is because the local people, or say a household level, unit level, they have lost the connect with making things, or the DIY culture, what they know. So in India, we have a craft community. We do have making everywhere. If we go out in the street, there are people who are making everywhere. But these communities, these craft communities, or the informal labor is very much, oriented in their caste. So urban people, say, who are in a specific set of socio-economic urban class, they are not into making, and so they wanted to fill this void by creating a space. When they came back, they saw this opportunity that such a space can also come up in cities, where people can also start making things, even though they are not associated with any of these caste-based crafts or artists or somewhere. So that's how they come in, and that also somehow intersected with this the new Niti Aayog and their innovation missions, so specifically the Atal Innovation Mission, that was funding, and that was open to ideas of setting up these innovation communities. So all these things promoted them to set up these spaces. And since Bangalore is known for its innovations and startup culture and everything, so it was the first preference for all these people to set up a space here. In terms of governance, yes, they do not have a connect with the municipality. So our interaction with the makers, they always used to tell, not only in Bangalore, but also the maker spaces we interacted in Pune, in Mumbai, they say that municipalities, we always run in conflict with municipalities. It's very difficult to convince them on what we are doing and why we are doing so. In terms of so it is a problem in terms of that, and also in terms of the how it is seen by the funding bodies in India. We have to see that these independent maker spaces who are situated outside of any educational institution or say SNT based universities are not being recognized or supported. So the idea of makerspace has always been an independent community who is not associated with any R&D institute or any university, any laboratory, but through the Niti Aayog's Atal Innovation Mission and the other DST supported projects, these makerspaces are somehow being incorporated into schools and the universities through Prayas Shala programs of DST, and say these Kendriya Vidyalayas. So the governance system has been exactly opposite on how makerspaces are in the West and how they are being seen in practice in the global South.
All right, thank you, Gautam. Mijo, just you have one question if you've seen in the Q&A, so if you could talk a little bit about that. Because from my side, I'm sort of just curious that your work is situated in Kerala, which has the unique geography of the rural and urban sort of bleeding into one another much more so than many other parts of the country. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit about how some of the things that you're finding would travel beyond sort of the Kerala context.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Basically, first I'll respond to the question in the Q&A section. The paper is not trying to say that the marginalized communities are not at all benefited from the socioeconomic transformation. In fact, they are benefited from the service-led economy and the newly formed jobs such as the domestic workers or drivers, etc. But the underlying inequality in the sense, the dominant communities moving forward, they are able to diversify their investment into transnational migration and accumulate capital to that. But at the same time, they are diversifying locally, and the underlying inequality in terms of land and residential segregation and all is still there. So I'm not at all trying to say that they are not benefited from the socioeconomic transformation. And regarding the second question, yeah, it's true that from early times, the Kerala is exhibiting the rural urban continuum. But if you travel, especially the Midland and Highland areas, can understand the urban, the characteristics of the village, the so-called urban characteristics is changing during the neoliberal, especially you can see a growth of service sector everywhere there, and the investment of capital in multiple forms, it's an extension of rural urban continuum, but is anyway, as I showed, it forms the neoliberal consumer spaces and service sector. So it exhibits new characteristics in the neoliberal period.
Thank you for that, Mijo. Malik, if I could circle back to you, my question to you was, extension as the vocabulary in the way that you talk to us about it is very freeing. It allows so much more to be sort of seen in the way that urban life and urban living is being sort of extended across these activities. My question is more if you could reflect a little bit more and elaborate and tell us how you feel like this idea of extension would feed into more conscious and more directed sense of urban politics, mobilization around urban politics. And in this, it's, my question is also coming from the fact that in the face of structuring that is coming not only from the neoliberal moment and the practices around neoliberalism, but also a sort of a turn towards the right and a very sort of a decentered, a socio-political life that is, emerging as more restricted, more conservative, sometimes more defensive, and across geographies. So if you could tell us a little bit more about how to think about the idea of extension within sort of the moment that we are living through, especially as urban politics is concerned, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right. It is a very foreboding moment everywhere in terms of the way in which a sort of diffusion of life is counteracted through a kind of reiteration of very base, banal forms of identification, of enclosure, of restricted mobility in face of a kind of generalized undermining of the capacity of many people to secure particular forms of livelihood. And in some ways, there is a kind of schism in terms of the way in which, for example, urban majorities across the world are reacting to this kind of intensified precarity, where some really attempt to dig in, hold on, establish clear boundaries and bastions of circumscribed operation, and others who are either unable or unwilling to do this, whose lives are enacted in much more dispersed circuits of itineraries, multiple emplacements, provisional livelihoods, strange alliances of all kinds, that exceed the kind of terms of familiarity. And these trajectories seem increasingly to run in parallel to each other. And so just a way to address this is to, in some ways, and there's a disproportionate, unequal calculus of visibility, because those that are extended are in some ways less visible because they are enacting their lives in terms which are increasingly difficult to find a kind of common vocabulary. The movement is such is that what is it that you then indeed hold on to? So one needs a kind of methods in motion to, in some ways, follow the circuits, follow the itineraries, be engaged with them in some ways. It doesn't obviate at all the danger that you're posing, but it's just an important kind of point of emphasis. For example, I just spent a month in Tangier, which is a region that is one huge construction site. And one can clearly see, the kind of real estate politics, the foreign investment politics that inform this kind of massive construction site. But I was interested in one particular district, how this district is being composed and built. And on one level, these are all very discrete individual property development projects whose genealogy seems really well familiar and traceable. But then when you actually ask who's building it, how is labor mobilized, who will come to live there and occupy it, who's arranging all of the kinds of paperwork and authorizations to allow it to have some kind of official existence, you begin to see the intricate circuits amongst these kinds of different projects, the overlays, the entanglements, the conversations, the sharing and trade of labor, the whole idea of what it means to occupy and inhabit and to build and to, all of these are really incredibly entangled as these discrete things extend themselves to each other. So it's simply a kind of method of trying to understand how particular dispositions are composed. And what seems obvious on the surface, most highly visible, is what you're saying, a kind of retrenchment, a kind of a sense of enclosure in all aspects, psychological, political, spatial. But I think it just calls upon us to try to pay attention to other trajectories that are proceeding and in some ways have to proceed because we live in a world that in some ways can't be enclosed. I mean, just in terms of the physics of inhabitation, just in terms of the physics, fascism can't in some ways exist within its own terms. And then we have to find what those other terms are and find methods to closely engage them.
Thank you so much for that, Malik. As always, so much to think about in there. I'd like to thank everybody who joined in, and special thanks to all the panelists. This was a fascinating session. I still have so many questions, but in the interest of time, of course, we do have to close. Just a quick note to everybody who's joining in for the next panel. It will start at 4:30. So please use the link that is there on the website to register for that panel. So see you all very soon in about a half an hour or so. Thank you again to the panelists, and thank you everybody who joined in for the conversation today.
Thanks, Sudeshna.
Thanks
so much.